The house appears long before you step close enough to touch it. Althorp rises from the Northamptonshire countryside as if the landscape has been waiting centuries to cradle it. Even on a quiet morning, when the fields are wrapped in mist and the sunlight barely reaches the treetops, the estate carries itself with the calm authority of a place that has shaped lives, influenced destinies, and preserved memories long after the people who made them have moved on. Its pale, honey-colored façade seems to glow from within, and the long approach road, shaded by ancient trees that form a kind of natural cathedral, guides you toward a residence that has witnessed more history than many nations. Nothing about Althorp feels accidental. The symmetry of its front, the stillness of its lawns, the measured placement of every path and statue create an atmosphere that feels both intimate and monumental. Anyone walking these grounds senses immediately that this is not merely a country house in the English tradition, but a place built to imprint itself on those who live within its walls. And it did exactly that. Long before the world knew her name, long before her face appeared on magazine covers, or her compassion transformed the lives of people she would never meet again, a young girl ran across these lawns, danced on the marble floors inside, and learned to see beauty in the smallest details. Here, in the silence of its long corridors and the echoing halls where sunlight moves slowly across polished stone, the foundation of her character quietly took shape. Inside, the air feels cooler, touched by the breath of centuries. The black and white marble floor of the great hall creates a soft resonance with every step, as if the house remembers each footfall and answers gently in return. The wood-paneled walls seem to lean in, carrying the warm scent of age and polish. Light filters through tall windows, sliding across portraits and sculptures collected by generations of one of Britain's most influential families. Even the quiet holds a certain texture here, layered, rich, and filled with the echoes of people who once moved through the space with the confidence of those who believed their home would last forever. It is impossible to ignore how naturally the house frames the story of the girl who grew up to captivate the world. The vast parkland surrounding the estate, stretching across thousands of acres, mirrors the openness of her early life. The dignified order of the interiors, designed with precision and intention, contrasts with the lively, spontaneous energy she carried with her even as a child. And the estate's sheer scale, at once protective and overwhelming, reflects the complex world that awaited her beyond these gates. Althorp was not simply the backdrop of her childhood. It was the silent teacher that shaped her understanding of elegance, responsibility, and the weight of heritage. Yet, for all its grace, the house never flaunts its significance. It stands quietly, almost modestly, as if confident that anyone who lingers long enough will sense what lies beneath its beauty. A story stretching back 1,000 years, woven from ambition, reinvention, upheaval, and triumph. A story too vast to grasp at first glance. And that is why, to understand how this place became the cradle of one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, we must turn our attention to the beginning, long before the young girl, long before the famous family name, long before Althorp became the estate the world recognizes today. Long before the great avenues were planted or the elegant façade took shape, the land that would one day become Althorp was nothing more than open pasture, a quiet stretch of countryside dotted with small timber homes, and the smoke of hearth fires rising gently into the sky. The earliest records describe it simply as a settlement, with a name that shifted through the centuries, shaped by the tongues of farmers, laborers, and wandering clerics. It was not a place anyone expected to stand at the center of national history. It was simply land, fertile, calm, and waiting. Over time, the modest medieval village that once stood here began to thin. Families moved, cottages fell silent, and by the early 16th century, the last residents had vanished entirely. The reasons were never fully recorded. Some believed poor harvests forced people to leave. Others suggested the landowners had ambitions that no longer included small tenancies. Whatever the cause, the departure left behind an expanse of fields unburdened by obligation or structure. What remained was an extraordinary opportunity for someone with vision, means, and the boldness to imagine a future none of the villagers could have predicted. That someone arrived in the form of a determined entrepreneur whose wealth came not from titles or royal favor, but from sheep. He had grazed his flocks on this very ground for years, watching the seasons change across the hills and seeing promise where others saw only grass. When the entire estate was offered for sale, he seized it, purchasing thousands of acres for a sum that would prove to be the most transformative investment in his family's story. The land that had once fed villagers would now nourish a new kind of legacy, one built not slowly by generations of farmers, but swiftly through the ambition of a single, strategic decision. With the purchase came the beginning of a future estate. Though at first nothing about the land suggested grandeur, there were no sweeping drives, no galleries filled with portraits, no lakes reflecting the sky. The earliest version of Althorp was little more than a simple brick house, surrounded by fields that rolled outward toward the horizon. Yet, even in this modest form, something significant had taken root. The house was not built as a mere residence. It was built as a declaration that the family had arrived. A foothold had been claimed. A foundation had been laid. The quiet pastures began to change as the new owners reshaped the landscape to suit their rising status. Boundaries were redrawn, paths redirected, and the first small steps toward transformation took place. Timber gave way to brick. The surrounding fields were reorganized to support a more efficient estate. Workers arrived to tend the land, maintain the structures, and slowly expand the nucleus of what would become one of England's most recognized country houses. What emerged over the following decades was more than a home. It was an idea taking physical form. The land that once supported a modest village was molded into the beginnings of a center of influence, a place where ambition was no longer tied to survival, but to prominence. Nothing about this early chapter hinted at the magnificence that would follow, yet the essential shift had already occurred. The pastures had become property, the property had become a seat, and the seat was becoming a symbol, and all of it began here, on quiet ground where sheep once grazed, with a simple purchase that would ripple through centuries and guide the estate toward the moment when it would raise one of the most iconic figures of the modern age. The first real transformation of the land began when the new owners decided that the modest structures scattered across the fields were no longer enough to reflect the direction their family was heading. What had started as a practical purchase, a clever investment rooted in the wool trade, was gradually turning into something far more ambitious. With prosperity came confidence, and with confidence came the desire to establish a residence that could speak for the family long before they ever stepped through a door or greeted a guest. The earliest major construction was a Tudor-style house built of warm red brick that stood out vividly against the green pastures. It was not extravagant by the standards of the later estate, yet at the time it projected unmistakable intention. Tall chimneys, steep gables, and wide hearths signaled a family placing its first solid brick in the long wall of its future status. The estate's new center was still surrounded by open land, but the addition of a carefully planned residence altered everything. The building's presence changed not only the landscape, but also the family's understanding of themselves. They were no longer simply people who owned fields. They were people who shaped them. That original house became the heart of the property, a kind of architectural anchor. It hosted meals, negotiations, celebrations, and the slow accumulation of possessions that marked generations of gradual elevation. Its walls witnessed the family's first steps into the circles of influence they would one day dominate. And though it lacked the monumental beauty that would later define Althorp, it provided exactly what was needed in that moment: permanence. The family had a home that could shelter their ambitions and offer a recognizable center from which their influence could expand. Over the years, as their wealth and social standing grew, the Tudor house absorbed additions. A new wing here, a redesigned room there, each one small but intentional. These quiet modifications carried an unspoken message. The family expected to remain. The house grew along with their aspirations, and every expansion reinforced the idea that Althorp was not simply a residence for one generation, but the foundation of something larger. It was not yet a palace, but it was no longer a farmhouse. It stood at the midpoint between modest origins and the grand identity toward which the family was steadily moving. What made this period remarkable was not the scale of the architecture, but the speed at which the estate evolved from an opportunistic purchase into a budding dynastic seat. The 800 that secured the land proved to be one of the most consequential investments of its time. With each passing decade, the estate's influence deepened. the family's name grew heavier with recognition. Visitors who once saw a simple brick manor gradually encountered a residence representing rising authority and ambition. Yet, even though the Tudor house marked an important turning point, it would ultimately become just the prelude to a transformation far more dramatic. The architectural identity of Althorp, the one the world recognizes today, was still centuries away. The outlines of the future estate remained hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the era when the family would possess the confidence, wealth, and vision to reshape their home with grand gestures rather than cautious steps. And so, the modest red brick house, born from pragmatism and quiet ambition, began its slow evolution into a symbol of lasting legacy. But the final form of Althorp, the façade that now draws visitors from across the world, would emerge only after the family entered a new phase, an age of reconstruction, reinvention, and architectural daring that would redefine everything they had built so far. The turning point came when the family, already established and steadily ascending in influence, decided that the Tudor house no longer represented the scope of their ambitions. By the late 17th century, England itself was transforming. Politics were shifting, aristocratic power was concentrating, and families who intended to remain significant needed homes that could speak with the authority their names were gaining. The modest red brick residence that had once been a proud declaration of permanence now felt more like a starting point than a final statement. And so, in 1688, a decision was made that would alter the estate forever. The old structure was not simply renovated, it was reimagined. Builders and craftsmen arrived in waves, their carts loaded with stone, tile, timber, and tools. The air around the estate filled with the sound of hammers striking chisels, scaffolding creaking under the weight of workers, and the low murmur of constant planning. What stood on the grounds before had been a respectable country home. What began to rise in its place was a statement of unmistakable confidence. The transformation was bold. The exterior was redesigned with a new classical symmetry, signaling a departure from Tudor practicality toward a grander architectural language inspired by the great European houses of the era. Mathematical tiles, chosen for their elegant illusion of finely laid brickwork, were applied to the façade, creating a surface that caught the sun with a richness the original house had never possessed. The new exterior expressed not only refinement, but ambition, a message to anyone approaching the estate that the family within was no longer simply prosperous, but prominent. One of the most striking additions was the set of 4 Corinthian pillars, crafted from Yorkshire stone, intended for a far different destination, the iconic cathedral in London. Their presence on the front of the house immediately elevated the entire composition. They transformed the entrance into something ceremonial, a threshold designed for formal arrivals, diplomatic visits, and the kind of guests who shaped national history. To stand before those pillars was to understand, without a word spoken, that this was no ordinary residence. This was an emerging power center. Inside, the adjustments were equally dramatic. Ceilings were raised, windows expanded, and rooms enlarged to accommodate gatherings that went far beyond the scale of a traditional country visit. Grand corridors replaced modest hallways, and the layout shifted to allow movement through the house with a sense of procession rather than utility. Light flowed differently now, illuminating spaces designed for impression rather than convenience. The house, which had once embraced a private, familial atmosphere, now possessed the grandeur expected of a seat capable of hosting noblemen, scholars, foreign dignitaries, and, eventually, those tied to the royal circle. As the new Althorp took shape, the estate surrounding it evolved in tandem. A residence of such stature demanded proportionate grounds. Avenues were extended, formal approaches were refined, and the overall landscape was reshaped into a composition that placed the house firmly at the center of attention. Anyone arriving at the estate would now experience it as the family intended. A gradual revelation of power, taste, heritage, and cultivated authority. By the time the renovations were complete, the property had become something entirely different. It was no longer a secondary seat or an agricultural holding, elevated by a fortunate investment. It had become a landmark, a place capable of receiving the most distinguished visitors, a home that reflected not just wealth, but identity. This was the moment when Althorp crossed the line from respectability into magnificence. Yet, even with its new architectural brilliance, the transformation of the estate was far from over. The walls now stood ready, polished and imposing, but the true character of Althorp would not be defined by stone and symmetry alone. What happened inside, the gatherings, the conversations, the intellectual pursuits and artistic passions, would soon shape the estate into something far more influential than a grand house. It was about to become a cultural force. Once the house had acquired its striking new shape, the family wasted no time transforming it into one of the liveliest social hubs in the country. The great halls, wide staircases, and glittering rooms were not built to sit silent. They were built to be filled. And soon enough, the quiet estate that had once known only the soft sounds of livestock and wind over the fields began to pulse with gatherings that grew more elaborate with every passing season. Visitors approaching the entrance during these years often heard the festivities long before they stepped inside. Music drifted through open windows, spilling down the avenues lined with lanterns. Horses stamped impatiently at the arrival courts as coaches rolled in one after another, delivering guests dressed in silks, lace, and embroidered coats. Candles flickered behind tall windows, illuminating faces flushed with excitement, while servants moved with precision through hallways carrying trays of food so extravagant they seemed designed to impress as much as to nourish. The house was built for spectacle, and spectacle became its rhythm. Balls stretched long into the night, filling the saloon and adjoining rooms with dancers who moved beneath ceilings lit by hundreds of candles. The polished floors, warmed by the music of string ensembles positioned near the staircase, reflected the whirl of gowns and the gleam of buttons and jewels. In moments of stillness, one could hear conversations flowing like the rhythm of the evening. Alliances formed, gossip whispered, futures decided in the brief pause between dances. Some events became so large that the estate expanded far beyond the house itself. On warm summer nights, the gardens turned into vast open-air reception grounds, their paths glowing with lanterns and the scent of flowers carried across the lawns. Musicians would play from shaded corners, creating layers of sound that drifted through the trees. The estate's scale allowed for gatherings that blurred the line between celebration and festival. Thousands fed, hundreds entertained, and countless stories born beneath the moonlit sky. Not every moment was meant for public eyes. Weddings were held quietly, hidden behind the grandeur. Guests danced and toasted without realizing that somewhere within the maze of rooms, two members of the aristocracy had exchanged vows in secret, determined to keep their union concealed until the timing was right. Althorp held those secrets easily. Its walls were thick enough to muffle whispers, and its rooms numerous enough to hide love, ambition, or scandal when necessary. Even the surrounding villages felt the energy of these grand occasions. The family, known for its generosity and flair, often extended festivities beyond the estate gates. One remarkable celebration involved thousands of local residents gathering to enjoy food, drink, and entertainment provided by the family. A gesture that fused aristocratic magnificence with a kind of public festivity rarely seen on such a scale. In moments like these, the estate became something more than a private residence. It became the heart of the region, a source of excitement, pride, and unforgettable stories. Inside the house, the atmosphere during these decades was electric. Rooms that today feel serene and dignified were once filled with voices, music, and the constant movement of people. Servants worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating meals of astonishing complexity, preparing accommodations for visiting dignitaries, and ensuring that every detail, from the placement of candles to the pairing of wines, met the family's exacting standards. Althorp became known for hospitality that combined extravagance with warmth, turning each event into something guests recalled long after they returned home. The house, with its grand new design, had found its purpose in hosting gatherings that echoed through history. It was no longer just a stately residence. It was a stage where the elite came to celebrate, form alliances, and revel in the splendor of a family whose influence was growing with every passing year. In these moments, the estate lived at its fullest, every beam and brick animated by the energy of celebration. And yet, as dazzling as these festivities were, they represented only one layer of Althorp's identity. Beneath the champagne toasts, beneath the music that filled its rooms, another legacy was quietly forming. one rooted not in revelry, but in the minds and passions of those who gathered in its quieter corners. The true heart of the estate would soon reveal itself in pursuits deeper than dance and louder than laughter. As the echoes of music faded each morning and the last carriage disappeared down the long avenue, another rhythm began to guide life inside the estate. One quieter but far more enduring. Over time, the family's interests shifted from celebration to something more introspective, and the house that had once shaken with laughter gradually filled with the rustle of parchment, the scent of aged leather, and the steady accumulation of knowledge. What began as a personal curiosity soon expanded into a passion so consuming that it reshaped the identity of Althorp just as dramatically as any architectural renovation. The first books arrived modestly, tucked into cabinets and placed on small shelves in private rooms. But as each generation discovered the pleasure of collecting rare volumes, histories, philosophical treatises, classical works, illuminated manuscripts, the house began to evolve around this growing obsession. Cabinets turned into bookcases, bookcases transformed into lined walls, and eventually entire rooms were claimed for the expanding collection. The family no longer saw books as simple possessions. They became symbols of intellect, culture, and refinement, objects that connected the estate to the great ideas circulating across Europe. The transformation accelerated when one member of the family embraced this passion with remarkable intensity. What had once been an admirable collection gained momentum that seemed unstoppable. Shipments arrived from London, Paris, Venice, and Vienna, crates filled with first editions, antiquarian treasures, and texts so rare that acquiring them required not only wealth but influence. Auction houses came to know the family's representatives well, and rival collectors spoke of Althorp with a mixture of admiration and competitive unease. The estate was no longer acquiring books, it was devouring them. The long library soon became the crown jewel of the house. Nearly 200 feet in length, it stretched across the west side of the estate like a great artery pulsing with knowledge. Towering bookcases rose almost to the ceiling, each shelf carrying volumes bound in deep greens, burgundies, and warm chestnut tones. Sunlight pouring through tall windows played across gold-embossed spines, creating a soft glow that made the entire room feel like a sanctuary for thought and imagination. Scholars who visited spoke of the collection with awe, noting its breadth, rarity, and sheer ambition. But even this monumental space was not enough. As the collection expanded, it spilled beyond the library's walls. Corridors that once guided guests toward ballrooms or private chambers gradually filled with shelves, transforming the pathways of the house into intellectual galleries. Visitors walking from one wing to another passed through narrow canyons of books, each step echoing softly against centuries of gathered words. The estate's character shifted from a place designed for entertainment to one devoted to study. Rooms that had once housed musicians or dazzling feasts now became workspaces where rare manuscripts were examined by candlelight. Among the most prized acquisitions were medieval incunabula, early printed works, maps, and religious texts with handwritten marginalia that whispered the thoughts of readers long gone. Some volumes were so old that their pages felt almost weightless, fragile as pressed leaves. Others were monumental in size, their bindings thick enough to require two hands to lift. Every new arrival deepened the estate's reputation, drawing historians, writers, and thinkers who recognized that Althorp was becoming one of the most extraordinary private libraries in Europe. The atmosphere of the house changed accordingly. A visitor wandering through the estate in those years would have found quiet rooms where pages turned gently, where scholars debated ideas beside tall windows overlooking the lawns, and where members of the family retreated for hours, lost in the worlds unfolding within their books. The hum of thought replaced the clatter of grand dinners. Conversations became more philosophical, reflecting the growing intellectual spirit that defined the household. The estate, once known for its festive nights, now earned admiration for the depth of its cultural pursuits. But this vast collection was more than a symbol of wealth or learning. It became a defining element of the family's identity. It shaped their tastes, influenced their relationships, and guided their contributions to the political and cultural life of the nation. Althorp evolved into a center where ideas traveled as fluidly as guests once did, where knowledge was valued not as decoration, but as the very core of the estate's purpose. As the decades passed and Althorp's reputation as a cultural stronghold deepened, an unseen tension began to build beneath the surface. The grandeur that defined the estate, the vast library, the refined interiors, the endless grounds requiring constant care, demanded resources of a scale that few families, no matter how influential, could sustain indefinitely. What began as a symbol of triumph slowly evolved into a weight that pressed more heavily with each passing generation. The very magnificence that had elevated the estate now threatened to undermine it. Maintaining a property of such size was not merely a matter of paying servants or polishing silver. Roofs had to be repaired, windows replaced, timber treated, and stonework maintained against the slow erosion of time. The mathematical tiles that gave the façade its elegant character required careful attention. The gardens, originally designed with precision and artistry, needed constant tending to retain the symmetry and balance that defined their beauty. Even the water features demanded labor, dredging, cleaning, reinforcing. Every corner of Althorp, from the cupolas to the cellars, required skilled hands and steady funding. The intellectual brilliance of the library, a source of immense pride, added its own financial burden. Rare books were fragile and costly to preserve, and acquiring new volumes became a habit that was difficult to restrain. What had begun as a passion evolved into near-constant financial strain as collectors' markets grew more competitive and prices soared. The family's commitment to scholarship and cultural refinement enriched the estate intellectually, but emptied coffers with alarming speed. The lavish social world of earlier generations also left a legacy that was expensive to maintain. Visitors had grown accustomed to a certain standard, meals crafted by accomplished chefs, entertainment of the highest quality, rooms prepared with meticulous care. Hosting events that matched the house's reputation required an army of staff and a budget that stretched far beyond the profits of agricultural work or traditional investments. Each generation felt compelled to uphold the magnificence of those who came before, even as the cost of doing so spiraled beyond control. Gradually, signs of strain began to appear inside the house itself. Rooms once filled with vitality and purpose fell silent. Bedrooms that had hosted guests of distinction remained unused, their fireplaces cold and their windows shuttered. Portions of the house were closed off to conserve heat and reduce the constant wear on the floors and walls. Some wings grew eerily still, their long corridors holding only the faint scent of old wood and the echo of footsteps from years long past. In the library, the burden was even more visible. Though the collection had once been a source of immense pride, it became clear that not all treasures could be preserved. Rare manuscripts that had been acquired at great expense were quietly removed, boxed, and sent to auction. The news of each sale rippled through academic circles, where scholars lamented the gradual dispersal of one of Europe's most astonishing private collections. But the family had little choice. Maintaining the estate required sacrifices, and the library, magnificent as it was, represented value that could be converted into survival. The auctions became more frequent, and the estate's financial records grew increasingly grim. Debt, once manageable, swelled into a force that shadowed every decision. At times, it seemed that the family's entire destiny was being dictated by the need to save the house. The structure they had built to symbolize greatness now demanded resources so vast that it threatened to consume the very legacy it was meant to protect. Letters from the period speak of difficult choices, reducing staff, delaying essential repairs, and searching desperately for new sources of income. Conversations once filled with intellectual debate and cultural pursuits shifted toward discussions of repayments, interest, and the painful process of parting with family treasures. The contrast between the house's imposing exterior and the quiet desperation inside its walls grew sharper with each passing year. Althorp's magnificence had become both its pride and its burden. The estate was too grand to abandon, too important to let decay, and too costly to sustain without drastic measures. Yet even as financial storms gathered, the house endured, its walls holding firm against uncertainty. What had begun as a symbol of ambition now stood as a testament to resilience, an estate fighting to preserve its identity in a world that was changing faster than its ancestral traditions could adapt. By the dawn of the 20th century, Althorp stood at a crossroads, a house with centuries of triumph and turmoil behind it, and the weight of its future resting squarely on the decisions of those who now cared for it. The financial storms of earlier generations had left visible marks, yet they also ignited a determination to restore the estate's dignity. The family recognized that the house could not survive on legacy alone. It needed renewal, and so began a new era defined not by lavish spending or grand expansions, but by preservation, careful planning, and respect for the estate's rich architectural history. Restoration work touched nearly every corner of the property. Cracked plaster was replaced by skilled hands who matched the original textures with remarkable precision. The stonework on the exterior, weathered by centuries of rain and wind, was strengthened and cleaned until it regained the soft glow that had once impressed visiting aristocrats. Windows that had rattled in their frames for decades were repaired or replaced, filling the rooms with steady light instead of the drafts that once haunted them. Roofs were reinforced, beams inspected, and faded paints matched to colors recorded in old family documents. The interiors also underwent thoughtful renewal. Wallpaper that had peeled from age was replaced with patterns chosen to honor earlier styles, maintaining the estate's historical character while bringing freshness to rooms that had long been dormant. Carpets worn thin by generations of footsteps were lifted and replaced with new ones, woven in the same traditional patterns. Furniture passed down through the centuries was repaired by craftsmen who understood its lineage, restoring luster to wood and stability to joints without erasing the subtle marks left by time. Certain rooms, particularly those that had once hosted large gatherings, were given renewed purpose. Chandeliers were cleaned until they sparkled again, sending soft light across polished floors. Portraits, their varnish darkened by age, were carefully restored, revealing colors and expressions that had faded into shadow over the years. Rooms that had once felt tired now felt alive again, as if the house itself were preparing for something significant. A turning point that would once again fill its halls with energy. Even the grounds experienced a rebirth. Avenues of trees were replanted where storms or disease had thinned the rows. Garden beds were redesigned to echo earlier centuries, with flowers chosen for their historical accuracy as well as their beauty. The great lawns were carefully re-leveled and reseeded, returning their sweeping expanses to the smooth, immaculate condition that had once made them famous. Paths were repaired, lakes dredged, and statuary cleaned until the entire estate began to resemble the elegant vision of earlier eras. By the time the middle of the century arrived, Althorp was a portrait of quiet grandeur once more, not ostentatious or extravagant, but dignified, serene, and deeply rooted in its past. The house had regained its balance. The struggles that once threatened to overwhelm it were gradually replaced by a sense of readiness, as if the estate had gathered its strength for the next chapter in its long and storied existence. This was the Althorp that awaited a new generation. Its rooms stood polished and prepared, its gardens shaped with care, its hallways echoing not with parties or political debates, but with a calm anticipation. The estate felt whole again, restored not merely for the sake of preserving history, but to welcome a future that no one within its walls could yet predict. And soon, within these renewed rooms and reawakened grounds, a young girl would spend her earliest years, a girl whose life would carry the name of Althorp farther than the estate's founders could ever have imagined. The house was ready for her long before she took her first steps across its floors, prepared to shape her in ways that only a home built over centuries could. She arrived in a house already steeped in centuries of memory, yet Althorp absorbed her presence as if it had been waiting for her. The estate, restored and revitalized in the previous decades, became the landscape of her earliest experiences, a world of vast rooms, quiet corners, polished floors, and endless gardens where imagination had room to grow. Although the house had witnessed generations of children, her steps left a kind of brightness that softened even the most formal spaces. One of the rooms she returned to again and again was the great entrance hall, its black and white marble floor gleaming beneath the high ceiling. The acoustics of the room, created by the smooth stone and towering walls, made it feel almost alive when she moved through it. Here she practiced her dances, tapping lightly across the polished tiles, her footsteps echoing in cheerful rhythms that chased away the stillness of the older rooms. The hall, designed centuries earlier to impress dignitaries and visiting nobles, now carried the lively sound of a child whose energy transformed the grand space into a private stage. Near the hall lay a series of drawing rooms, some formal, others more intimate. In one room, decorated in soft blue and peach tones, she spent hours arranging small belongings, flipping through picture books, or sitting cross-legged on the carpet as sunlight spilled across the furnishings. The room's ornate ceiling and gilded details might have intimidated adults, but for her, it simply became another corner of home, a place where imagination ran freely among elegant patterns and delicate antiques. Across the wide corridor stood the picture gallery, stretching the length of the house like a silent museum. Portraits of ancestors watched from the walls as she passed through, their painted eyes following the quiet rush of a small girl, weaving between family history and childhood wonder. Despite its length and formality, the gallery never frightened her. Instead, it became a passageway of curiosities, faces from centuries past, elaborate clothes, scenes of distant eras. A reminder that her own life was part of a much larger story rooted deep in this estate. Yet, her favorite explorations often led her to the upper levels of the house, where narrower corridors connected smaller, more private rooms. These areas, less grand and less polished, offered warmth and familiarity. Bedrooms filled with soft furnishings and gentle colors became places of whispered secrets, shared laughter, and the kind of quiet games only children invent. Here she found comfort not in scale or grandeur, but in the feeling of safety that came from knowing these rooms belonged to her world alone. Outside the interior chambers, the staircase stood as another cherished companion. The oak steps, worn smooth by generations of feet, became an adventure path, sometimes a slide for blankets, sometimes a lookout tower, sometimes simply a place to sit and listen to the distant sounds of the household. When she descended the staircase, its banisters polished and warm under her hands, she often paused midway to take in the view of the hall below. Even as a child, she seemed attuned to the mood of the house, noticing how light changed throughout the day, or how shadows settled between the pillars in the late afternoon. The gardens became an extension of her inner world. She wandered the lawns, chasing sunlight across the grass, and played among the carefully arranged flower beds. The trees, some centuries old, formed natural hideaways where she and her siblings invented stories and embarked on imagined quests. The lakeside, quiet and reflective, offered a place where she could sit and watch ripples travel across the water, her thoughts drifting as freely as the breeze that stirred the leaves overhead. In these surroundings, the earliest elements of her character began to emerge. The expansiveness of the estate nurtured her sense of openness and empathy. The grandeur of the rooms encouraged her innate dignity. The peaceful corners gave her space for contemplation, and the constant interplay of people, activity, and emotion within the estate formed the foundation of her natural warmth. Althorp did not simply shelter her, it shaped her, influencing the way she moved through the world even before she understood the significance of her name. Every hallway, every staircase, every sunlit room still carries an echo of her presence. Her laughter, her dances, her footsteps became part of the estate's memory, woven into the same walls that had witnessed centuries of transformation. And as her childhood unfolded within these rooms, the house itself seemed to respond, embracing the bright, sensitive girl who would grow to touch hearts far beyond the estate's ancient boundaries. When she eventually left Althorp, the change inside the house was almost immediate, as if the very air shifted in her absence. For years, her presence had added a kind of movement to the estate, footsteps racing down corridors, soft laughter echoing up staircases, doors opening and closing with youthful spontaneity. When all of that disappeared, the silence that settled over the rooms felt heavier than any stillness the house had known before. It was not an abrupt or dramatic change. It was a quiet, gradual withdrawal, like the dimming of warm light at the end of a long day. The great entrance hall, once alive with the crisp sound of her dancing steps, grew calm again. The marble floor that had amplified her rhythms now reflected only the subdued tread of household staff or the occasional visitor. The acoustics, once filled with playful echoes, reverted to the hush they were originally designed to hold, impressive, reverent, and solemn. The tapestries and portraits gazed down at a quieter scene, unchanged in body, but transformed in spirit. In the drawing rooms where she once arranged toys or sat near the windows, dust motes floated slowly through beams of sunlight without being disturbed by movement. Cushions remained exactly where they were placed each morning. The soft blue and peach tones of the furnishings seemed slightly cooler, as if missing the warmth of a child's presence. Objects in these rooms, polished tables, framed photographs, small ornaments collected over generations, took on a more formal character, the room shifting from lived-in comfort to a preserved elegance. The long picture gallery, where her curiosity had once carried her from portrait to portrait, grew notably still. The silence felt different here, thicker somehow, as if the gallery itself noticed the missing energy that once animated it. Even the floors, long accustomed to the rhythm of her hurried steps, seemed quieter, their boards no longer warmed by the carefree movement of a child weaving between ancestral faces. Bedrooms that had echoed with morning routines and nighttime stories settled into a calmer pattern. Beds remained neatly made for longer stretches of time. Wardrobes closed without a trace of playful tugging. The soft thud of books being placed on nightstands no longer sounded through the halls. These rooms shifted into a more reserved state, preserving memories rather than generating new ones. It was as though the house, aware of the significance of her departure, held these spaces in place out of respect. Even the staircase, so often a pathway for her adventures, grew contemplative. The banisters that once supported her hands during daily races to breakfast or slow descents in the evenings now reflected the light without interruption. The thrum of family life, once strong enough to carry from one end of the house to the other, faded into occasional murmurs and distant footsteps. The estate took on a rhythm that felt steadier, older, and more aligned with its centuries of tradition, yet tinged with a subtle sense of longing that only those who knew her could fully understand. Outside, the gardens retained their beauty, but the atmosphere shifted as well. The lawns where she once played remained impeccably kept, yet somehow quieter, as though waiting for a sound that no longer came. The pockets of shade beneath ancient trees became resting places for memory rather than destinations for childhood games. Even the water near the lakeside seemed calmer, reflecting clouds and tree branches with an undisturbed surface. The staff felt the change deeply. Those who had seen her running through the halls or had exchanged brief smiles with her in the corridor noticed the difference most sharply. The estate had always required maintenance, precision, and discipline, but now their work carried an additional layer, a desire to preserve the spaces she once animated, as if caring for the house was, in a small way, caring for the memory of her time there. Yet Althorp did not fall into gloom. Instead, it adjusted, returning slowly to the composed, stately rhythm it had held for centuries before her arrival. It understood, in the quiet language of old houses, that children grow, families evolve, and destinies lead people toward paths far beyond their first home. The estate had given her space to become herself, and now it waited patiently, holding her early years gently within its walls. And in that stillness, in the gentle settling of rooms that once glowed with her presence, the house prepared to witness the next chapters of her life unfold from a distance, its role in shaping her complete. The warmth she had left behind remained woven into every corridor and stairway, traces of her early spark lingering in the atmosphere long after she stepped beyond the gates. In the late summer of 1997, Althorp found itself thrust back into the center of global attention with an intensity it had never experienced before. For centuries, the estate had been a place of quiet continuity, a private world tucked behind its long avenues and ancient trees. But on that August morning, the world shifted, and the house that once sheltered a joyful child suddenly carried a weight that reached far beyond its walls. People who had never heard the name Althorp now spoke it with reverence, sorrow, and a sense of disbelief. The estate, which had shaped her early years, was now called upon to hold her memory in a way it had never been asked to hold anything before. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on the grounds changed as if the estate itself understood what had happened. The long tree-lined drive, usually serene and undisturbed, felt charged with a heavy quiet, as though the wind hesitated to move through the leaves. Staff walked the halls softly, speaking in low voices, aware that every room, every portrait, Every echo now carried a different meaning. The house that had once nurtured her, and then waited patiently through her adulthood, was now preparing to receive her again in a moment of collective grief felt across continents. When her funeral procession made its way toward the estate, the world watched. Millions followed the journey through screens, yet it was Althorp, not a palace, not a cathedral, but her childhood home, that became the final destination. The choice felt both unexpected and deeply fitting. Despite all the titles, duties, and global reach of her later life, it was this quiet estate in Northamptonshire that represented safety, memory, and roots. Here she had laughed, danced, played, and dreamed. Here she had been simply a child, shielded from the demands the world would one day place upon her. Bringing her back to Althorp was an act of returning her to the one place where her story had begun without expectation or scrutiny. The arrival of her cortege transformed the estate. Thousands gathered at the gates, placing flowers, messages, drawings, and photographs along the imposing walls. The floral tributes grew so quickly that they carpeted entire sections of the grounds, their scent filling the air even from a distance. People who had never set foot inside the estate felt compelled to travel there, to stand as close as they could to the place where she would rest. Some came in silence, some in tears, others simply standing in reflective stillness, united by the feeling that they were witnessing something far larger than a private family moment. Althorp had become a place of shared sorrow, a focal point for collective remembrance. Inside the grounds, preparations were carried out with quiet precision. A small island on the round oval lake, a peaceful, secluded place surrounded by water and protected from intrusion, was chosen as her resting place. The choice reflected both respect and understanding. She had been someone the world embraced intensely, yet she had longed for peace. The island, accessible only by boat, offered that peace more completely than any public monument or cathedral ever could. It gave her privacy, dignity, and a sanctuary shielded from the pressures she had faced throughout her adult life. As the ceremony unfolded, the estate seemed to hold its breath. The lake reflected a gray sky, and the surrounding trees swayed gently, as if acknowledging the significance of the moment. Family members, gathered on the shore, watched as she was laid to rest in what would become one of the most visited and most protected memorial places in modern history. The world, though kept at a respectful distance, remained connected through broadcasts, tributes, and a universal sense of loss that bridged nations and cultures. In the days and weeks that followed, Althorp transformed again, not through architecture or ownership, but through meaning. It was no longer just the ancestral seat of a great family. It had become a site of pilgrimage. Visitors traveled from across the globe to walk the grounds, to visit the memorial temple overlooking the lake, and to leave tokens of remembrance in quiet corners of the estate. Even those who never entered the gates felt a connection to the place, imagining the island surrounded by water lilies, the trees arching above it, and the calm that settled over the lake at dusk. From that moment onward, Althorp carried two identities: the private home it had always been, and the global symbol it had suddenly become. It now held the childhood memories of a beloved figure, and also her lasting presence. Its lawns, trees, and rooms inherited a new resonance, not just history, but reverence. The estate could no longer exist solely as an aristocratic retreat. It had become a part of the world's emotional landscape, a place where memory and legacy intertwined so tightly that they could never again be separated. And after that day, Althorp would never return to being an ordinary country house. It had entered a new chapter, one defined not only by its past, but by the enduring light of the person it now guarded. The island at the center of the round oval lake had always been a gentle, unassuming feature of the landscape, a quiet circle of land embraced by calm water, visited only by gardeners and wildlife. For centuries it existed as a simple ornament in the estate's design, a serene accent to the sweeping parkland that surrounded it. No one who walked the grounds in earlier eras could have imagined that this small, tranquil place would one day come to hold the most tender and guarded chapter in Althorp's long history. When the time came to choose a place of rest, the decision required a balance of dignity, privacy, and symbolism. Cathedrals had grandeur, and royal chapels carried tradition, but none of them reflected the essence of the person the family wished to honor. She had spent her life in the public eye, surrounded by crowds and cameras, with her compassion always drawing people near, even when she longed for quiet. The family understood that her final resting place should not be a spectacle. It should be a refuge, protected, peaceful, and deeply connected to the place where she had once been able to simply exist, without the weight of expectation. The lake offered exactly that. It separated the island from the rest of the world by a natural barrier that required no gates or walls. Water, by its nature, creates distance without hostility, a gentle boundary that discourages intrusion while preserving beauty. The moment one looked across the surface, smooth on still days and rippled lightly by wind, it became clear why the island felt like the right choice. It provided solitude, reflection, and a sense of being held in a quiet embrace, shielded not by stone but by nature. Transforming the island into a memorial required delicate work. The family wanted a space that honored her without turning the estate into something theatrical. Gardeners planted white roses that echoed her grace, their soft blooms brushing against the air with a purity that matched the spirit the world remembered. Water lilies were added to the lake, creating a floating constellation of pale petals that drifted around the island like small, living lanterns. Even the trees were shaped with care, trimmed so their branches formed a gentle canopy over the water's edge, casting dappled shade that softened the outlines of the shoreline. Every detail was chosen with intention. The path leading toward the lake was lined with a series of evenly spaced oak trees, one for each year of her life, creating a quiet procession, a slow unfolding of memory as one approached the water. The trees stood tall and steady, their presence offering both strength and a reminder of time's unbroken continuity. They marked not only the years she lived, but the lasting impact her life had on the world beyond these grounds. Across from the lake, positioned at a respectful distance, a small memorial temple was built. Its classical design echoed the estate's architectural language, aligning the tribute with the heritage of Althorp rather than separating it from the estate's history. Inside the temple, a silhouette carved in dark stone stood against a backdrop of white marble, an image that captured her in poised simplicity, neither grand nor ostentatious. Beneath it were words chosen not to amplify sorrow, but to honor the compassion, grace, and quiet strength that defined her. Visitors who stepped inside the temple felt the shift immediately. The stillness, the soft echo of their movements, the sense that this was a space meant for contemplation rather than display. The choice of the island also allowed the family to maintain a balance between public remembrance and private sanctuary. The world was welcome to come and honor her at the temple, to walk the grounds, to stand by the water, and feel the quiet settle around them. But the island itself remained off limits, accessible only to family members. It protected her in a way she had rarely been protected during her life, gently, respectfully, and without compromise. Even today, the water around the island reflects not only the sky and surrounding trees, but also the promise that this final refuge will remain undisturbed. Over time, the lake and its island became one of the most recognized yet most carefully guarded memorial landscapes in modern history. People who visit the estate often speak of the moment they first see the island, the sudden hush that seems to fall over the air, the peacefulness that settles across the water, and the unmistakable feeling that they are witnessing something deeply personal. The lake does not reveal everything. It invites reflection rather than revelation. And in that invitation, Althorp became more than a historic estate. It became a guardian, a quiet keeper of the memory of someone whose life had been lived under a relentless spotlight. In safeguarding her rest, the estate fulfilled a role it had quietly prepared for across centuries. A protector not just of history, but of humanity. And from that point forward, the story of Althorp could no longer be told without the presence of the island, the lake, and the silent promise they continue to uphold. When the weight of the world's attention finally eased and the flow of mourners grew steadier and more contained, Althorp was left in a state that was both emotionally charged and physically strained. The estate had carried an immense responsibility, one that honored its most beloved daughter, yet emphasized the fragile state of the property itself. The emotional impact of those months was profound, but the structural impact, the wear on the grounds, The aging of the buildings, the long-delayed repairs, became impossible to ignore. In those quiet years that followed, the house faced a different kind of challenge: survival. Charles Spencer, who had inherited the estate at a relatively young age, understood immediately that Althorp could not continue unchanged. The property had weathered financial difficulties for generations, but now it faced a new era, one where the world associated it not only with aristocratic heritage, but with a global figure whose memory demanded protection and dignity. To sustain both the legacy and the living estate, decisive action was needed. The first step was confronting the extent of the neglect. Many parts of the house were suffering from the slow erosion of time: leaking roofs, cracking stonework, failing timber frames, and outdated utilities that had long surpassed their intended lifespan. The façade, once gleaming beneath the soft English sun, bore stains and damage from centuries of wind and rain. Mathematical tiles, the unique outer skin that gave Althorp its distinctive appearance, had loosened in places, threatening to slide free if not repaired. The grounds, too, required careful restoration, especially after months of heavy foot traffic during the period of public grief. Charles launched a restoration effort so ambitious and complex that it soon became one of the most extensive preservation projects the estate had ever seen. Over several years, scaffolding encircled the house, sometimes covering nearly the entire structure. Craftsmen skilled in traditional techniques were brought in from across the country to replicate old methods with modern precision. Each tile, each piece of stone, each wooden bracket was either restored or replaced with materials that matched the original design exactly. The work demanded not only enormous financial resources, but also a deep respect for the estate's architectural integrity. Inside, the repairs were just as intense. Ceilings were stabilized, wiring upgraded, plumbing modernized, and structural reinforcements added to ensure the house could safely support visitors, exhibitions, and future generations of the Spencer family. Rooms that had suffered from dampness, disuse, or outdated infrastructure were revitalized, keeping their historic character while making them functional for a new era. Paintings were cleaned, carpets rewoven, and furniture restored by artisans who understood that each piece represented a chapter in the estate's story. Such undertakings came with staggering costs, millions upon millions of pounds. To meet these financial demands, Charles made choices both pragmatic and painful. He organized a monumental sale of items from the estate's vast attics and storerooms: artworks, antique furniture, historic objects that had accumulated over centuries. Some were treasures of great significance, others were pieces that had simply outlived their place in the house's daily life. Each sale sparked both sympathy and controversy, but the results were undeniable. The funds generated helped preserve the estate's future. Agricultural adjustments also played a role. The surrounding lands, historically farmland, were repurposed with more efficient management strategies to ensure long-term income. Investments were made in sustainable operations, aligning the estate with 21st century values while maintaining its traditional landscape. At the same time, Charles opened limited public access to Althorp during specific months, allowing visitors to experience the house while ensuring the estate's privacy remained intact. This delicate balance required thoughtful planning, but it offered a dependable flow of support to keep the property thriving. Throughout this period, Althorp became a project of resilience, not just a house restored, but a house reborn. The repairs did more than preserve walls. They revitalized the spirit of the estate. The façade regained its luminous color, the grounds flourished again under the careful work of gardeners, and the interiors once more reflected the quiet grandeur that had defined Althorp for generations. Rooms that had felt heavy with memory slowly regained a sense of purpose, not forgetting the past, but carrying it with renewed grace. The restoration marked a turning point. Althorp was no longer merely surviving, it was stepping confidently into a future shaped with intention. Yet once the dust settled and the scaffolding was removed, a new question lingered in the air, a question that had not been asked so directly before. With the estate repaired, stabilized, and positioned to endure, what should Althorp become in the modern era? Should it remain a private sanctuary, an ancestral treasure, a public memorial, or something entirely new? The path forward would require not only preservation, but vision. For the first time in centuries, the estate stood at a moment where its past and future were equally powerful forces, each shaping the possibilities ahead. And the answer to that question would determine the role Althorp would play in the 21st century and beyond. In the years that followed the Great Restoration, Althorp settled into an unusual and delicate identity, one that no other English estate quite shared. It had always been an aristocratic home, shaped by generations of Spencers and preserved through cycles of triumph and hardship. But now it carried responsibilities far beyond those of a traditional ancestral house. It needed to honor its past, sustain its present, remain accessible to the world, and yet protect the private memories that rested quietly within its gates. Althorp became, layer by layer, a house of many roles: museum, symbol, sanctuary, and living family home. Each summer, the gates opened to the public, inviting visitors to walk the pathways that stretched across the grounds and explore select rooms inside the house. This seasonal access was carefully designed, a window, not a full unveiling. Visitors strolled through grand spaces lined with portraits and polished floors, guided by staff who understood the estate's history with almost familial familiarity. Tourists from across the world arrived not only to admire architecture and art, but to experience a place they felt connected to through a story that transcended borders, class, and culture. Inside the staterooms, curated exhibitions revealed fragments of the estate's complex legacy. Manuscripts, letters, portraits, and artifacts showcased not just the history of the family, but the evolution of the estate's cultural and political significance. Some rooms carried a quiet elegance, others a more personal warmth, each reflecting a piece of Althorp's long narrative. The displays were not static. They evolved over the years, shaped by careful decisions about which parts of the family's story could be shared and which deserved to remain private. Yet, even as Althorp welcomed visitors, it held on to its character as a private residence. Whole wings remained closed, corridors untraveled by guests, and rooms untouched by public view. These spaces continued to function as part of the living estate, places where staff worked, where records were kept, where the family gathered in quiet moments far removed from the curious eyes of the world. Maintaining this balance required constant calibration. The estate needed the revenue generated by visitors to support ongoing preservation, yet it could not risk becoming a spectacle or a theme park. This balance sparked frequent discussion, both among those who cared for the estate and among those who visited it. Some admired the respectful structure of the public openings. Others questioned the cost of admission, comparing it to other historic homes across the country. Debates arose about whether the estate was being overly commercialized or simply taking necessary steps to survive in an age when maintaining such grand properties required careful financial planning. Every adjustment in ticket price, every modification to tours or exhibitions, every new public initiative had to navigate the delicate intersection between heritage, economics, and emotion. And then there was the memorial. The island on the lake, though never accessible to visitors, remained the most quietly powerful presence on the grounds. The memorial temple nearby offered a place for reflection, its simplicity contrasting with the estate's grandeur. Visitors paused there, looking across the water toward the island, aware that they were witnessing something sacred, yet intentionally distant. It was not a museum piece, not part of entertainment or tourism. It was a refuge, and its boundaries were absolute. Althorp's custodians understood that protecting this sanctuary was more important than any commercial consideration. The lake and its island shaped the estate's entire approach to public access. Respect was not optional. It was foundational. Even the criticisms that occasionally surfaced, complaints about ticket prices, concerns about restricted access, or debates about exhibition choices, reflected the estate's unique position. People cared deeply about Althorp because it had come to symbolize more than aristocratic history. It represented memory, compassion, and the idea that even in a world of constant change, some places hold meaning that cannot be reduced to simple transactions. In this way, Althorp balanced itself between identities with careful grace. It was an aristocratic home with centuries of tradition. It was a historical landmark that offered insight into political, cultural, and architectural evolution. It was a memorial site visited by people from all walks of life, each carrying their own connection to the figure honored there. And it was a private sanctuary, still lived in and loved by the family whose presence allowed the estate to remain not just beautiful, but alive. And yet beyond these practical and symbolic roles, something deeper flowed through the house, something that guided its future more profoundly than economics, tourism, or heritage preservation ever could. Hidden beneath all its functions was a quieter truth about what Althorp had become and what it continued to protect. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the mist settles over the lawns and the first rays of sunlight touch the mathematical tiles of its façade, Althorp reveals itself not merely as an estate, but as something alive, a presence shaped by centuries of footsteps, decisions, joys, burdens, and transformations. Few houses endure long enough to witness the rise and fall of entire eras, or to reflect the changing values of the people who inhabit them. Fewer still absorb all of this, and continue to stand with the same quiet dignity, offering shelter to memory instead of being overwhelmed by it. Althorp is one of those rare places where history feels less like a series of past events and more like a pulse running through the rooms. Over the centuries, the estate has reinvented itself again and again. It has been a Tudor manor, a grand classical house, a center of political conversation, a refuge for scholars, a hub of celebration, a seat of financial strain, and eventually a deeply personal sanctuary intertwined with global emotion. Each transformation left marks on its architecture, its gardens, and its atmosphere, giving the estate a layered identity that no single generation could have created alone. Every room carries traces of the people who lived, learned, dreamed, and loved within its walls. Althorp has also survived hardships that would have undone lesser houses. Economic pressures nearly hollowed it out. Maintenance demands pushed it to the brink more than once. Changing times threatened the relevance of traditional estates. Yet, with each challenge, the house adapted. It shifted roles, welcomed new ideas, and allowed itself to evolve while retaining the core of what made it extraordinary. It learned to balance its heritage with its responsibilities, finding ways to remain vital even as society moved further and further from the world in which it was built. But above all its stories, the parties, the politics, the intellectual pursuits, the centuries of inheritance, one chapter stands apart, woven so tightly into the estate's identity that it is impossible to imagine Althorp without it. The memory of its most cherished daughter lingers in the air like the soft echo of a familiar melody. Her presence changed the estate forever, drawing the world's attention to a house that had already lived 1,000 lives. Her childhood footsteps, her bright energy, her complex journey, and her enduring legacy transformed Althorp into a site of remembrance unlike any other. The house protects her now with a resolve forged from centuries of guardianship, offering her a peace that eluded her beyond its gates. As the years move forward, Althorp continues to navigate its place in the modern world. It remains a home, a historical landmark, a memorial site, and a symbol of resilience. The estate breathes in rhythm with the seasons, the quiet of winter mornings, the vivid greenery of summer afternoons, the turning of leaves in autumn, and the delicate bloom of spring flowers along the lake. It is a place where time feels both present and distant, where the past lingers but never overwhelms, and where the future waits with curiosity. And for all that has been revealed, for every documented renovation, every celebrated legacy, every carefully preserved story, there are still corners of the estate untouched by public eyes, still rooms whose histories are whispered rather than told, still pathways in the gardens that carry secrets known only to the house itself. Althorp holds more than it shares, guarding memories that stretch far beyond the stories we think we know. Because in the end, Althorp is not just a historic estate or a family seat. It is a living entity, shaped by centuries, strengthened by endurance, and illuminated by the life of the woman whose legacy made it unforgettable. And somewhere within its rooms, gardens, and quiet lakeside reflections lie the stories that have yet to be uncovered. Stories we will explore more deeply as the full narrative unfolds.